My name is Ben Wan. I'm a principal with Rohde Architects based out of Boston, Massachusetts. We're an architecture and design firm. Our expertise varies from multifamily housing to institutional work, commercial, and hospitality interiors. Madeline, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And thanks, Ken, for the intro. Super excited to talk about 52 New Street today. I'm Madeline Lee. I'm a project manager at Just to Start. And I think we have a little bit more about Just to Start and our kind of affordable housing work that I can get into in the next few slides. So
Yeah.
we can kick it
So
off.
I can put a little bit of context. So this presentation, as Ken mentioned, we shared this at the Passive House Symposium here in Boston last month. And that symposium, just to give a little bit of context of what you're going to see here in this presentation, it was structured around the theme of raising standards and lowering costs. So this was presented as a case study of an example of a project currently under construction in our fine city of Cambridge. And we focused in on a couple of just inflection points of how the goals between the mission of the project, the design, and really the parameters that the city set out for us, how those might have played against some of those inflection points where Passive House is really pushing for high level of envelope performance, high level of detailing, and what were some of the sort of lessons learned that we are taking as we go through construction for this project. Just to give some more context of what you'll see in these next coming slides. So to kick it off, Madeline, as mentioned, she'll go through some of her organization's mission and goals, and then I'll take over the presentation and go a little bit more in depth into what the nature of the project is, describe everything from its genesis down to where we are now wrapping up construction, and then we'll pass it back to Madeline to talk about how her organization is managing kind of a growing portfolio of work.
Great. So I think we can go next slide, but I'll introduce a little bit more about Just to Start. We are a nonprofit, a community development corporation based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We've been around since 1968. So our work in housing goes back a long time. And in addition to creating affordable housing in the Cambridge and Greater Boston community, we're really focused on creating pathways to economic equity and access through means like stable housing and workforce development programs. So we extend beyond the housing sphere, and we really focus kind of in a holistic way around how to support residents. So we're based in Cambridge, and this is our building, which also happens to be a Passive House certified building. And so, yeah, I can share a little bit more. Next slide, perhaps, on Just to Start's housing specific goals and kind of how this feeds into the conversation today about 52 New Street and how Just to Start ended up focusing more on developing Passive House buildings. So we are stewards, developers, and supporters and advocates for residents when it comes to housing and affordable housing. So this just kind of gives an overview. We are developing new rental affordable housing primarily in Cambridge and Somerville, Massachusetts. We also work with a lot of individual homeowners who might need to make energy efficiency improvements or accessibility improvements, and also with kind of emergency financial assistance and mediation. But right now, we're working on developing over 400 new affordable rental and homeownership units in our area, and that includes the 52 New Street project. Can do the next slide, please. So as Ben was prefacing too, kind of we wanted to center in on this presentation of kind of there is a theme of raising standards and lowering costs that we wanted to speak to. And I wanted to go all the way back to kind of how did Just to Start get on the track of focusing in on Passive House as a real opportunity that supports our work and our mission focused on creating housing affordability and creating much needed housing. So talking to the team that I work with at Just Start, it really came back to being on the cutting edge of housing quality and creating kind of the best possible product for our residents that we work with. So 52 New Street is the third passive house project that Justice Starts worked on in recent years. And so we've kind of been through this learning process of scaling up with project teams, starting with the Squirrelwood project, which is also in Cambridge, and Ringe Commons in Cambridge, which were completed in 2021 and 2024, respectively, towards working towards 52 New Street, which we're expecting to be complete early this year, pretty soon, and which is also the largest new development and largest passive house project that our organization has worked on to date. And so some other pieces too that we've been learning about and how we've been able to kind of implement this into an early goal too is really making the decision early on and in the project team hiring phase, being upfront in RFP and architect selection processes to get those project team consultants on board early and get the design process focused on passive house as the owner-driven goal too. There's been a lot of local and state support too for meeting these goals. I put the logo of the Mass Save incentives and Mass Save program there at the bottom. Just we have definitely been able to take advantage of some rebates for the feasibility costs and design and modeling costs and for finished projects certification, which really supports that early upfront work that's needed to get these projects to certification and through feasibility. And I'll also just add that, as affordable housing developers, we secure project financing from local and state partners. We're very lucky to be, working with City of Cambridge and Somerville in Massachusetts that are supportive of many climate resilience goals and have also, been on board with passive house projects as seen as more competitive too when it comes to awarding their financing. So all of these pieces do help us move projects forward, but ultimately, we see the benefit in housing quality, for residents, and then for Justice Start as an organization being the long-term building owner, going hand in hand with this, and that can reduce costs, increase the quality of the air quality indoors, or just the experience living in the building. It makes sense to meet this goal. So that's a little more background, and then so just kind of continuing with how we've thought about residents throughout the process and decisions for 52 New Street. As I was mentioning, this is a more significant project for us to be taking on with our portfolio. When the building's occupied, there's going to be over 450 or so residents in the 52 New Street building. And so we both wanted to think, long-term upfront, what are some features of the building that will kind of enable resident choice and think about affordability. And so these do include, in this case, individualized HVAC systems for a little bit more resident control. We have noted there's gas-powered hot water. It's not an all-electric building still, and that was kind of just a cost-effectiveness choice at the time of design. But our long-term commitment to affordability was also in thinking about how can we reduce, resident utility costs. In this affordable building, residents do pay for their own electricity, but are given a utility allowance. So we're thinking forward towards, how can some of these costs be tracked, and we'll talk to that a little bit more later on in the presentation. But just even small changes every month or over time that can kind of reduce some of the costs by, being a more efficient building can go a long way for households of more limited means. And lastly, just the paying attention to how resident comfort will continue to be a factor as 52 New Street is occupied, and just some feedback we've received so far from other passive house buildings too is that the temperature control and the kind of insulation that leads to better in-unit acoustics, or kind of insulation relative to your neighboring unit when in a larger building can kind of improve the experience of living in the community overall. So some considerations we had on the developer end up front, and I'm going to pass it over to Ben to talk more about design approach.
Thank you, Madeline. So Rhodey, as I mentioned, we're based here in the Northeast in Boston, and the firm was really founded on the principle that design has an intrinsic power that can really transform lives. And we sought to bring that to every arena where we are working. And part of that has really distilled itself down to these three values that we've come to recognize in ourselves. And one is that we are working to build communities. And I hope as you hear this, you'll start to hear some resonance between us and why we are really excited about this partnership with Just a Start. So building a community to us could mean actual physical spaces, buildings or structures or neighborhoods. And you'll see imaged here the three Brucewood homes. They're the first PHI certified homes in the city of Boston. They're down in West Roxbury. And that was a partnership with one of our other long-term clients to build speculatively. So they were built without a client or an owner in mind, just to see how the market took, and they sold before even construction was completed. So it's proving that there is really a strong appetite for passive house homes. We also think of community building as the people and the social structures that we're looking to support through equity and accessibility in the buildings that we're creating. We always use our design process to build our projects around a central design concept. We find that concept through exploration of the physical site or the history of a place, or the goal or the mission that our client brings. And by building our designs around that foundational concept, we find that we can create something that is immersive and cohesive and really enriching for the user who occupies the space. And some of the most projects that inspire us as a studio are those where we have the opportunity to further a mission. So in this instance, taking Just a Start's goal of providing access to the riches of Cambridge, the rich experience of Cambridge to families who might not otherwise be able to afford it, and to think about what creating a space that supports those residents would look like. So the site at 52 New Street is in the northwest corner of Cambridge. I gave you a map here on the bottom left hand of the screen. You can see we're at the end of the red line, Alewife. We're about a half-mile walk from that site, and we're located near the Fresh Pond Reservoir here on the upper right, and the Danny Field, which is one of the larger new parks that Cambridge has built. Danny Field is really provides a rich context for us to build in. The site was formerly a clay pit where they were excavating the clay to build the bricks, which they used to build the city of Cambridge and Boston. And then once that industry left, the town reverted that to a dump. So it was actually a place for the refuse of the community. And when the MBTA Red Line was extended from Harvard up to Alewife in the 80s, they took the excavation and the dirt from that, and they used it to cap the landfill, and then turn that into this new amenity for the community and for the city at large. So already we're seeing how there's these ideas of layers of history of the city in the site, and the sort of regenerative idea of turning something back into something that's green and that can be a part of serving the residents of the community, and how we can think about how Passive House would tie into that as a design concept and as a facade language. So the Danny Fields, then capping all of that landfill, is actually elevated up off of the street 16 feet. So it has this raised platform type condition that is really an interesting condition that we used as we're thinking about how our program of our site is responding to that abutting condition. It's a very long and narrow site. It has about 120 feet of frontage at the street, and then it's 400 feet deep. So we're thinking, how can we situate the program and the access, pedestrians, bikes, cars and trucks and loading, how we can make all of those pieces work on such a narrow footprint. And we're also in a flood zone. So out here in the northwest corner of Cambridge, there's some low-lying lands that are subject to flooding. So we have to keep in mind how our building is going to respond to elevations and grade changes while we're thinking about the populations that we're serving that need accessibility and ease of access. So as we're evaluating that site, thinking, of course, initially massing is a critical step in how we're treating our design and how that reacts in terms of passive house performance. So with that long and narrow site frontage and the abutting condition of the park and that distant view that you could have of the reservoir and fresh pond in the distance, what is the form that this building wants to take and how it will respond? So obviously the most economic approach may have been to take a double-loaded corridor and extend it the length of the site and just have that simple extrusion. You would have a very clean rectangular form, but that would put itself in tension with potentially the experience of the residents and how their spaces are responding to the green space next door, how the building is responding in terms of its form and its scale and its character to the residential neighborhood. You can see on the right side of the screen, there's a sort of medium scale existing context of buildings that are 3 to 6 stories in height. And then there's also laying on top of that the goals of the city. So as Ken mentioned, this is the first project that was approved through the city of Cambridge under the Affordable Housing Overlay. And what that did, it was voted and approved by the people of Cambridge. It allowed for increased density relief from the zoning code if you provide 100% affordable housing on your site. And so as this project is providing 100% affordable housing, it's allowed to be a little bit taller, be a little bit closer to the property lines, and have a little bit more density. So it was very important for Just to Start and for Rhody for this design to be successful in fulfilling for the lives of the residents, but it was also important for this project to prove that the AHO zoning could deliver projects of a high quality that were contextual and that had that fit in with the context of a city like Cambridge. So part of the massing studies you can see in the bottom left, we're looking at different ways of organizing a mass in a program on the site. And where we landed was this idea of these dueling courtyards, where you have one that sort of carves away from the building and opens up this view to connect some green space on our site to that rich verdant landscape of the Danhe Fields. And then another elevated park, you can see in orange there, elevated roof deck that takes advantage of solar orientation. That's more of a private, secluded space for the residents, but then also has some distant views towards the Fresh Pond Reservoir. So as we were evaluating this with our passive house consultant, as we were moving through design, it was Opal Architecture based out of Maine. We were evaluating what the area to volume ratios were of the facade to the floor plate, but also thinking about what are these principles that the city will approve and that will work for the program that we have for the residents. So that dynamic massing that resulted from those two dueling courtyards resulted in a floor plate and a massing that did break down the scale of the building significantly. So we were able to take what was really long, that 400-foot long building, break it down into a series of masses that did begin to thread itself into the context of the neighborhood of New Street and of that residential neighborhood that was to our south. It also had the benefit of giving us some more exterior corners that worked for the program goals that Just to Start had. This building is almost 80% family-sized units, so 2 bedrooms and 3 bedroom units. And with those forms and the shifting of the courtyard, we're able to make those 3 bedroom units, give them a good solar orientation, good exposures to the park and to the distant pond. You'll see a construction image on the bottom there that shows, I think we were up to about the 5th floor at this point. You'll see the structure that we are using. It's a podium construction. So that, for those of you who aren't aware, that's a concrete and steel at level 1, and then 5 levels of wood construction above that. And you'll see our open web wood truss construction that's spanning from demising wall to demising wall for 1 bedrooms. We do have some intermittent bearing walls for our 2 bedrooms because the spans are longer. And that was in close collaboration with our structural engineer, Richmond So Engineers, to understand the bearing capacity and the depths that we need for those trusses. Because this presentation was structured around kind of lessons learned, one of the little nuggets that we've learned from this, our demising walls and our bearing walls were built off of a 2x4 structure. So a double 2x4 to give you that acoustic demising wall. And that was with the goal of trying to give every inch back that we could to the residents of the building and of these units. And really that resulted in a denser quantity of wood than I think maybe had we gone with a 2x6 construction for those bearing walls, we would have been able to lighten some of the loads on these upper floors. So that's one trade-off that I think we'll use to inform some of our future designs. So those 106 units that Madeline mentioned are on those upper 5 levels of wood construction. You'll see this section diagram shows the nature of our buildings program configuration. We have a retail space that's located off of New Street. We have that break in the massing that provides this nice open courtyard at grade that allows residents to come off the street into this courtyard and then enter into a central lobby. And by centralizing our elevator, we're shortening the walk that residents have to go once they come up those elevators into their floor to get to their unit. We have a good amenity program at level 2 with some community spaces, a business center to support residents' needs, a fitness center, and per Cambridge's direction, 1-to-1 bike parking. We're at a 0.3.4 parking ratio for vehicles and 1-to-1 bike parking, looking to feed into transit-oriented design as much as possible with this project. And then in some of those massing steps that we have here at the southern end of our property, here, recall, this is where we're fronting onto that residential neighborhood to our south. We're able to carve a new a lounge and a roof deck for the residents up at that upper level. So I think the meat of what everyone wants to know about this project, how is it performing? How did you build it? What are the components of it? So those of you who have had the pleasure of drawing this red line diagram, critical part of understanding the air sealing approach to the project overall, but then in each of these key critical junction points. I know we could go for an entire hour about going over each one of these moments where we transition from one material to another, from one plane to another. But I'll go through in the next couple of slides some of those key inflection points where we had a push and a pull between insulation levels. You can see we have some pretty robust envelope constructions. Our exterior wall with a 2x6 cellulose filled cavity and then 6 inches of exterior continuous mineral wall. We have sort of at the max an 8 inches minimum of continuous insulation with tapered above that, and then closed cell spray foam within cavity. Truly, we do have sort of a network of MEPs and ductworks that are effectively reducing that R60. So to use this as a sort of a target was essential for us in our modeling. And then because we have this parking, which is open air, naturally ventilated, we have the passive house boundary transitioning up to the underside of the level 2 slab, where again, we had to use spray foam as both our air barrier as our thermal continuity. But we passed in the early models, seeing well below the cooling demand, but just making it with the heating demand for the project using the alternative criteria that we are allowed for non-renewable primary energy. I won't linger here. I'll admit that I'm not the passive house consultant on this job, so some of the more technical questions around this we may have to get back to you on. But suffice it to say, we were pretty tight in the thresholds and in the buffers that we had allowed ourselves as we entered into construction. Some of the way that we were trying to take passive house and express that in the facade of the building allowed us to take a very economic approach with the facade, in that we were taking a fairly simple massing approach. And you can see that the windows are stacking and there's not a lot of massing push and pulls in terms of bay windows or step backs in terms as the wall steps up towards the parapet. But we use the depth of that insulation, and this was actually a fairly successful and fairly well received aspect of the design as it was moving through community room and with the city of Cambridge, that we could take that depth of the facade and use that to create this shadow line and this added depth that would have this intermediate scale of additional richness. Here you'll see we're adding an additional accent panel of color to bring a little bit of character and warmth, and then using perforated solar screens at the living rooms. You can see our facade assembly there at the lowest level, our thermally broken green girt system with external hat channels and the 6 inches of mineral wool stuffed between them. So that the window jamb detail really became a good point of collaboration between us and Callahan Construction, who is building this, and they're doing a great job of working through how the logistics and the sequencing of all these details are working. So finally landing on a series of light gauge angles that are broken and that allow us to secure that jamb outboard of all of the air barrier that's secured here at the typical window jamb condition. You can also see in our facade language, recall way back to the history of Denny Fields and the kind of strata and the layers of history. We use that to inspire some of this shifting gradient that we're using in these earth tones to tie our building into some of that history of the site. All right, so that I showed 6 inches of outboard insulation, and that ties a little bit into the energy model and the push and pull between the different performing standards that we had to work with. As we were evaluating the various ERV approaches, you'll recall that Madeline and Just to Start are working to give the utility savings back to the residents. And so part of that meant working with an individual ERV approach. So this axon diagram shows the location of that ERV. We located it fairly discreetly back in a false ceiling above the bathroom. And that allowed for some fairly good ease of access to the building, to those ERVs for servicing, not in living room or bedroom spaces. And we went with sort of horizontal above the ceiling instead of that vertical, again, trying to give back as much square footage as we could to the residents for usable living space. But the implication that had was fairly long duct runs from the facade back to the ERV. So what happened as we were working through the final certification, final sort of pre-approvals, we had to derate the performance of the ERV from here showing 79% down to 65% due to those duct runs. So that was where the opportunity to potentially go from 6 down to 4 inches of continuous exterior insulation versus the sort of program goals that we had for giving these savings back to the residents and the location of the ERV. This is a kind of a push and pull and a tangle of elements that I think might inform some different decisions as we move into our next projects, thinking about how smart locations of that ERV and the need to service it and the way that it's impacting the energy model, thinking about how those all tie together. So another moment, lessons learned that we're learning from here at New Street is the idea that we have to use, per the zoning, per the city's requirement, some screening of the mechanical equipment up at the roof. And so anyone who's had to deal with wind loads of a metal roof screen, how that ties into a wood structure, understands the complexity of that joint and of that movement, and how those interface together. So as we were working with construction, we accepted some VE, which was a significant cost savings for the roof screen. That resulted in a change to the mounting condition and the change to the structural interface between the post and the roof trusses. That required a change to the structural detail. And then as we reviewed that with our construction passive house consultant, who was Stephen Winter Associates, there became raised some concerns about condensation potentially and the dew point dipping below that roof membrane and starting to cause some potential issues with our roof at each of those mounting moments. So as we were evaluating the different levels of insulation, where we were raising up additional continuous insulation above the roof, that had the implication of raising the height of the roof screen, raising those mechanical elements, or adding additional spray foam below the deck. All of those had some significant cost implications. So all to say, resolve some of these product procurement and detailing conditions early so that you can look at ways to save additional costs for those critical details. So the idea that we're trying to approach these projects with a strong sense of design and a strong sense of what these spaces and what these buildings can do for their residents. As Madeline outlined, the goal of providing safe, secure, quiet housing for the residents, providing it affordable for residents who couldn't otherwise come to Cambridge. How do you balance that idea of, increase richness in the massing. Where's the point where that outweighs the idea that you're going beyond the envelope to volume ratio and overly burdening the energy model in a way that is doesn't give back the enriched resident experience that you're trying to provide. Where are there moments where you're including a trash chute? We have a trash chute integral to the building, which really streamlines the operations and the management of this building. And with Just to Start, who is holding this into the future for the longevity of its project, it's worth actually working through the complicated air sealing details and sequencing of installation that requires. So the goals that we have as designers and as architects, as we bring our skills and our problem solving to projects like these, keep in mind the experience and the richness that you're providing for the residents who will eventually call places like this home. Madeline, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Ben. So last piece too, before we go into more discussion, is just to be a little more forward-looking as into occupancy. So, as Ben just mentioned in one of the previous slides about, Just to Start being steward of affordable housing for long term. These projects we have, deed restrictions and perpetuity for housing affordability. That's also built into the affordable housing overlay zoning that this project's being permitted under too. So this is kind of the shared outlook and also this piece around a growing kind of portfolio and resident population living in passive house buildings is really increasing in Cambridge and the local environment we're working in. And we want to have a good sense of how is that experience actually going as we kind of move from modeling construction to livability increasingly and for more and more of our residents. So I mentioned before, occupancy is on track for March 2026. And just for a sense of, why these questions are also so urgent for us is we had over 2,000 households apply to live in this 106 unit building too. So we want to keep doing more of this is the bottom line. So on the next slide, I can just share a little bit more of some of what we're thinking about. There's a component of, we want to review energy usage data, what happens year one and forward, and develop systems for collecting that information. At the same time, that involves a lot of work with residents. So there are, going to be consent letters and a process for making sure that, residents are okay with our building managers also having access to kind of overall energy usage data. We're expecting that, that could be a little bit of a imperfect process that's going to take some effort, but is something that I think coming into New Street with having learned a little bit more around what might be required to get a fuller picture of how is the resident experience going relative to maybe some opportunities we didn't fully take advantage of with the lease up and occupancy of the previous passive house buildings that we've worked on. We see this as a huge opportunity. But kind of beyond some of the quantitative, energy usage piece, like we want to also hear about resident experience and kind of like a more narrative, like what are the factors that we haven't thought about, kind of the impacts or outcomes of living in a passive house building that we might not know about. And that's going to take, talking to residents through advisory committees, which Just Start has established two throughout our portfolio, but also there could be one at New Street, thinking about ways to integrate our work on feedback loops with residents, which is what the poster on this slide is from. Just we have a team focused on working with residents more holistically to have an annual survey, and they've worked really hard to think about the different kinds of barriers to completing that and sharing that type of feedback and how to lower that, from having the survey in different languages to having staff who can work through digital navigation, whether it's or different means of completing a survey. And so I think all of these pieces, Just to Start really wants to integrate what we've learned and what we practice and know with a lot of our programmatic sides around feedback for continuous improvement and working with residents and community members into how we understand, our real estate development work and the true benefit that a passive house building can provide. So that's some of our thoughts on how to integrate there. And then I think on the next slide, we're going to summarize we see a lot of opportunities with New Street. And so, from those feedback loops that I was just talking about, I think we're hoping that, over a few years, we will have more data, more information that's really going to continue to help inform how we do projects into the future. Increasingly in, Cambridge, where we're working, passive house is more of the norm and kind of more of like what we're assuming from day one with the project, for both regulatory reasons and because we're learning and proving this out that there are project teams that are experienced and know how to jump in and do this. So we also are eager for more of the operations and maintenance training opportunities for staff and maintenance teams that we work with to learn both with New Street and projects moving forward. So this is kind of where we're looking to next, in addition to implementing the lessons learned on the development process for future projects. So I think I'll pause there because we're going to have more conversation.
Thank you, Madeline.
Yeah.
Ken, we can pass back to you.
It's such a beautiful and exciting project. Great organization and mission in terms of this. A few things to jump out. I think we're also missing a little context that maybe I should have set up front as well to our more national audience and international, that buildings of this size now are required by code to be passive house. So the option has slipped away, at least for the foreseeable future, and hopefully we can make it stick. But that said, you were clearly moving on this path before the law came into effect, and seeing, working with the incentives, which Massachusetts has the best incentives in the country around passive house, at all aspects of the process. So Madeline, I think for you to speak a little bit too, and then Ben, like your comfort in kind of developing project, implementing passive house performance, and working with the team members. So you mentioned the contractor, I think is this interest to a lot of people. You mentioned that you're working with Stephen Winter as consultants, who I think many are familiar with, but they're new players, and how working with the builders in particular, and the issue of cost and performance and moving through the process. If you could just give a little bit more sort of context there.
Yeah, sure. I can speak a little bit more to the project team, and I know there was also some questions in the chat around costs too. So Callahan Construction Managers is the general contractor for this project, and this is the second time Just to Start has built a project with Callahan. The first was Just to Start Squirrelwood project, which included kind of it was a combination, I think I'm like 14 or so buildings. There was a rehab and new construction component, and one of the many buildings in that project is a first passive house certified project that Just Start worked with. So Callahan does have the Cambridge experience and the passive house experience that kind of made them a good fit for this project. And then it was, yeah, go ahead.
Just did they work as a construction manager, or did you rebid the project out?
For 52 New Street.
Yes.
Yes. So they're yes, a general contractor and full construction management outfit. So we did bid the project out as well too. So it was competitive process with several general contractors. Yeah.
But they were with you along the design development.
No, they were not actually. Yeah. So,
Oh,
but we had a pre-construction phase, probably close to a year, where they were kind of on board with the team. Yeah, before construction started.
got it. Got it. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. Yeah. And then, yeah, so Just to Start did, I think, set out Passive House design in our um, RFP for architectural services, and then kind of had requested or worked with Rhody to include Passive House consulting services under their consultant team. But maybe Ben too, if there's anything else that you'd like to share on that front.
Sure. Yeah, and I would say Rhody, I mean, I wouldn't say we were certainly not the vanguard of passive house adoption, especially up here in the Boston area. I think there's a couple of firms that have just fully all in, and they've been building buildings, and they have sort of a portfolio of these to express. We had built those single families down in West Roxbury. We had sort of a great collaborative relationship with Opal out of Maine to really think about how we can implement this and how we can scale it up to a project here at 52 New Street. And I think we tried to point to the many pressures that I think came to this project. The idea that it had a really robust community engagement requirement for it. It had to prove something for design and how you would implement sort of a zoning language into something that is beautiful and contextual and has that really strong design forward idea to it. So how can we marry the goals of housing expertise, zoning compliance, design forward thinking, while integrating the principles of passive house is really how Rhody started to think about how can we use passive house as a skill to really push those other goals of building strong communities and building the sort of concept-rich architecture. So that's kind of how we're trying to think of how we're just most naturally folding passive house into our expertise and into our delivery. Ken, I don't recall what was.
Maybe. Sorry, go ahead.
No, there were other parts of your question, but I can't remember what they were.
Yeah, well, I wanted to elaborate a little bit, if you could, there, because I was wondering, as a firm thinking about creative exploration and developing concepts of projects and working with the mission of Just to Start and this project, and bringing, architecture from the beginning is kind of bringing art and math together in this functional way, cultural way. And as you're developing the architecture, has it just your working relationship with the client, with your own team, with yourself in terms of thinking about architecture, given the context of passive house? Or is it, is it offering significant constraints, or do you feel like it's something else that you're just, it's like gravity. It's something else you're gonna have to, the energy flow you're gonna have to deal with.
Sure. I mean, I think good architecture anyway is always considering orientation and massing and there's sort of a personal performance and experience of how a person's coming through and using the space and how the space can support their life from a holistic kind of approach. And that's where being able to sort of, this building has to thread together accessibility and energy performance and affordability and all the other kind of challenges that come with a population that has these kind of deeper need. And just the fact that we have now this growing technical ability and that our details are smarter and that these buildings are going to be better from a waterproofing and from an air tightness, that these detail, we're learning and we're kind of iterating and we're finding what the best detail is and what the best products are. But just the fact that there's going to be more of this, and as you mentioned, the building codes are pushing and requiring this now for buildings of this scale. So we're going to have better mechanical systems, and we're going to have better units that are reliable, and it's going to be faster in our approvals with the agencies over in Germany or here in the US, wherever you're interfacing with. All of that is just this more robust arsenal of design tools that I think is helping us be more true to those missions of providing spaces that are safe and that are resilient and that are performing for the residents. So I think we're excited by how much we're seeing built and by how much we can see the industry just gaining experience how confident Callahan was coming in that they could deliver this at the high standards to get it certified. So it's really an exciting time to be delivering housing at this scale, especially when we need it at this scale.
Yeah. So much housing. Speak to that, Madeline. And it sort of ties back to Ben, but looking at the different systems choices, and it was interesting to see, you know, it's one of the big debates in multifamily housing, centralized ventilation or decentralized ventilation, as well as the heating and cooling and what the opportunities and constraints that come with each. Thinking, Madeline, going forward, in terms of the feedback that you are getting or look forward to getting, I don't know if it's too early yet to tell, but how the team is thinking about sort of what Ben was just talking about, in the service of your mission, further optimizing the systems and the details in the process.
Mhm. Yeah,
Any,
yeah. I think it's a good question. I think there was a point in time, when the decision to go towards the individualized systems, occurred and made sense and kind of proceed from there. And as you go further into design, it becomes more costly to change to something else. I think we'd certainly like I don't think we're married to, we want all individualized systems moving forward. I think that Ben highlighted a lot of reasons and cost implications to the project as
Mhm.
a whole as to why that's, we want to consider kind of what will be efficient, long term and cost efficient for getting the project built. And then also I think so we'll hear back also from residents and as things get underway, for building maintenance, what's going to be a little bit easier to replace or maintain, replace filters over how many number of units. I think these are all pieces where we also work with our property managers to understand kind of what the project's looking like in practice.
Yeah, I was really interested to hear you mentioned the building, the maintenance team and the managers and the physical plant. I'm sure everyone here would love to get access to your feedback in the future on various things and the different projects, of course. Uh,
Yeah,
uh,
it's so exciting. It's such an opportunity to have someone like Just to Start who has a growing portfolio of multiple projects of different scales and even more looking down the pipeline to the next where they'll be building where there is and they're going to hold these and they're going to understand they're already engaging with the residents and getting sort of a holistic idea of how these buildings are serving them. So to think then that we'll have this kind of database of how these buildings are performing into the
yeah.
future is exciting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, question for you. There's a question about the go, no go, because I presume this was decided to go passive house before the law came into effect. And so in terms of the incentives and your movement with Mass Save and the teams that you're working with, um, could you speak a little bit, Madeline, to just your
Yeah,
organization's, you know, final push to say, yeah, we're going to do this.
for sure. Yeah, I think that so I wasn't on the team at Just to Start
Yeah.
when some of these decisions were made, but I do know, I think from going into New Street, I think in general, projects of this scale as an organization, we were on pretty on board with starting, day one with passivos and having learned that probably the best way to kind of capture some cost efficiency is to building it into design early on. So I think we can also calculate with the mass saves really, easy to work with, the transparent about what the feasibility incentives look like to at least, build that in from step one. Let's do a feasibility study. Let's, do an initial energy modeling to find out, can we continue on this path? And I think that's, an easy step to clear pretty early in a project. But I'll also say that, well, this passive house is not required for code compliance yet for 52 New Street. Cambridge does have some pretty ambitious, climate goals too. So there is some, local policy to that designing for Passive House and achieving Passive House certification was a pathway to achieve some of the local energy and climate goals too. And so that was kind of like a clear, this is the approach we can take to satisfy this requirement. Another reason to stay on that track for us too.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, this is a beautiful project. We understand it's not that far from being complete. Ben, how's the punch list going?
It's going great. The units look good. Amenity spaces are looking nice. And blower door test is coming up. It's that's the next big
All right,
thing.
no pressure.
Yeah.
No pun intended. Yeah, well, congratulations so far, and I'm sure it's going to perform wonderfully. These big buildings, they always take a bit of commissioning. It can be a surprise. I know you've been through a few buildings, so it's not your first rodeo, but having builders call or owners call up the next day after it's open and be like, oh, it's not working. It's like, yeah, give it. You're gonna have to commission it.
Yeah, at the scale of this.
But once you're through it, yeah, I'm really interested to find out more. Great. Well, we're at time. This is perfect. If there are any outline questions, I think we hit the big ones. Feel free to follow up by email. We can circle back around. I really appreciate your time today, Madeline and Ben. It was a pleasure participating in this with you, and look forward to hearing about more work in the future.
Thank you, Ken. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.